Thank you so much. So thank you so much to our speakers. We've now got about 15 minutes for questions, and then it's time for lunch. But before then, has anybody got questions for our speakers about either one of the presentations or a theme you've seen connecting them? I should say the microphone is a very funny little clip-on thing, which is going to be brought to you. Thank you so much to our helpers.
Okay. Oh, yeah, it works. Okay, this is actually a question in general, I guess, to everyone. It's because I'm struck by the title of this panel, which is Rethinking Imperial Collections. And it feels like we've been thinking about imperial collections. And maybe it's, I look at, for instance, First Nations and collections in the United States. And one of the, and so to me, rethinking means things like, why do we have these hundreds of objects here? Should we have them? How was it obtained? If it was sold, under what conditions? What does the object mean to its original owners? How would the original owners believe it should be curated? How can it inspire, to take Maria's word, how can it inspire not people here, but people in the Maldives or Borneo or New Caledonia, etc.? That to me means is what rethinking is asking. And I wonder if those are parts of the considerations when you're what I would call thinking about these imperial collections.
Okay, thank you. Any of our speakers like to start us off on that? Really interesting question. Right.
Yeah, so thank you for this question. Of course, in my research, all the objects from the world were collected, yes, to inspire local people. And I believe it will be really interesting to creating a connection to people in the place, in my case, in Sarawak, and understand how the objects were of use there. Because of course the knowledge is very different. But I'm also keeping a very archival, as you can say, very archival and object-based perspective in my research. But yeah, this is another point of view, another way to consider the collections.
Thank you. Sarah, I wonder if we come to you next, because you talked about an example where in the Seychelles isn't a kind of indigenous community from which objects came and to which objects could be of relevance today, but it's not as simple as just saying they're just plants. So I wondered if you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I speak about this more broadly in the work that I'm doing. I think what I'm trying to do is marry up the kind of current meanings of objects with the collecting stories to find out, to isolate how, in a way, to isolate how colonial ideologies were imposed upon them, how sort of, in a way, epistemological sort of, let's say, colonial knowledge was produced, so that we can see the limitations of it, to then break those things down and then understand how they've influenced colonial categories. A lot of the objects I write about they don't fit within neat categories of continents, and they speak of different heritages, different places. And what I'm trying to do, and then their collection fixed them. It made them fixed to place and by their classification. So what I'm trying to do is uncover there by looking more closely at the collecting stories to show what was missed out, what was forgotten, what has been meant absent from those moments, so that to then put back into those stories to show that much richer story of connection, which categorizes the Indian Ocean. Because a lot of Indian Ocean studies speak very richly of this is a connected space, and yet objects in museum collections are Africa. They are this, they are that. And when we've talked, Katie and I talked a bit about this, about, how you can overcome that. But that's how I see what I'm trying to do, is kind of really dig into that knowledge production moment and also see how islanders influenced it. How were they processing it and influencing, and how they've been written out of the story. So that's the way I'm trying to rethink those collections. And I hope that answers your question. I'm happy to talk about that more. Like I said, there's more about it in the bigger project, but it's a really important, obviously it's a very important bit, element of this story.
Thank you. Marianne, over to you next.
Thank
You know, you're sitting next to each other handily for the microphone.
We're on the first. Thank you. And yeah, I didn't really get a chance to talk through the kind of background research for this paper. But I mean, universally, the people that I interviewed and have interviewed since have in Northern Ireland across a range of different kind of identity backgrounds felt very strongly that interpretation needed to be indigenized. And there was almost universal support for repatriation as well of items. And obviously, you know, from a museum point of view, that needs to be underpinned by much stronger provenance research than we have access to at the moment. But I think what we've been trying to look at is what do people's perspectives of colonialism and imperialism in Ireland and participated in by the Irish, how do those perspectives influence people's perspectives on repatriation and indigeneity? Because when you start talking about decolonization as an idea, as a theme, very often unionist and loyalist and Protestant identities feel quite threatened. People of those identities feel quite threatened. But when you actually look at specific objects, the perspectives are very different, and there's a much greater support.
Thank you, Liz, for this very important question. Considering what you said about rethinking, I think that it is also something that we should, as researchers and practitioners, think we're embedded as something that is linked with the specificity of the territory and the place, the people with whom we are working in. The specific imperial history and colonial / post-colonial or decolonial situations right now. For the inventory of New Caledonia and what is done in New Caledonia, it is still an ongoing process to uncover the names that were given by the collectors at the time of the objects were collected. The provenance research and the history of this object is unknown for most of them. As you can see, the huge number of objects is quite impressive, and it's hard to work on specifically on each of them. But that's some of the, as Emmanuel Casareuto said a few months ago, when he did like a report of what have been done with this inventory. Now everything has to be done, and it's just the beginning, actually. And maybe I can just say that other inventories are also conducted within New Caledonia about the intangible heritage. So actually, this inventory is part of wider projects on intangible languages, etc. Both of them were conducted at the same time with the same idea to promote Kanak cultures, also by Kanak themselves, and not only by people coming from mainland France.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating theme emerging there about looking really closely at the specifics in order to know what the right kind of rethinking and what the right next steps are. So really lovely. So hand up over there. Next question.
My question is for Bryony and Emma. Your research into the museum sector and looking for evidence of decolonization, I wonder if in addition to shifts that you're seeing in programming and co-curation, whether there are institutions that are demonstrating more radical shifts at the kind of the architecture of the institution in terms of like leadership or co-direction, and if they're really interesting examples, because I think it's one thing to talk about maybe new kinds of programs or inclusivity, but very often when they're like called diversity hires, they end up being like revolving door situations because the actual institution is not shifting in a very kind of structural way. So I'm just curious if you found any examples of that happening.
I think we're probably I agree with you, and I think we're probably at an earlier stage. We haven't got to the governance level yet. National Museums NI, I can't speak for them because I don't work for them in Queen's University Belfast, but they're in the process of writing decolonising principles of their own for application to their own organisation, and it'll be very interesting to see when that comes out. You know, how they're applying those MA principles locally, and they have just appointed an assistant curator from a Zimbabwean background as a permanent hire, which I think is a great step forward. And he's now on the ethics committee for the Museums Association, so I think that's great to see. But south of the border, not greatly yet. There is diversity in the curatorial field, in terms of, there's a new traveller culture curator in National Museum of Ireland, which is fantastic to see. But I think, as is so often with Northern Ireland and Ireland, we're a step behind what's happening elsewhere. Perhaps Emma wants to respond to that as well. I don't know.
Emma, if you do, I'll have to unmute you. Just give me a minute. Oh, you've unmuted yourself. Off you go.
Just to say, I agree with what Bryony said. I don't want to talk at length about different institutions that might want to put their own perspective on what they're doing, but just to say that I think that there are a lot of different issues which organisations north and south are grappling with at once. Organisational change, like you spoke about in your question, and inclusion. And as Bryony and I mentioned in the paper, there is this kind of grey area between actions taken from an inclusion perspective and actions taken from an intellectually based decolonising perspective. And I think a lot of organisations are struggling with how to try to do both of those things at once, whilst also recognising the specifics of the circumstances in Ireland. So it's a challenging context, but I think there is a sense that organisations want to do a lot, and we've seen a great deal of interest in the work that we're doing, which we take to mean that organisations are really keen to make change, but the details of how you do that are still a big thing for a lot of organisations, especially national organisations, to work out with their stakeholders.
Thank you. And I'll perhaps add a personal perspective, which is in a previous job, we hired in the end 10 curatorial posts that brought diversity into the curatorial team in different ways. And I underestimated, although it seems so obvious in hindsight, the office politics of who got which office was the hardest thing to tackle, but the most important for making those people feel not just kind of welcome, but encouraged to try and change the place. But that was the single hardest bit of that whole diversity hiring process, was moving some people out of some offices. So, any other questions before we get time for lunch? We've got 2 minutes, but you may want to talk more over lunch as well, which would be absolutely fine. All right. Thank you again to our speakers. It was really wonderful presentation.